Most of you know the traditional image of Robespierre, at least as I had learned it myself in the books of Louis Madelin, who was the reference when I was a student. The image indeed of an incorruptible, but at the same time a kind of pungent pawn, an ice-cold fanatic, a sort of boorish guillotineur. Then, immediately, they would oppose Danton's face, saying, yes, of course, less incorruptible, but Danton is still the man of audacity, more audacity, at the Battle of Valmy. He was a man from whom came out a certain human warmth, whereas Robespierre, this cold, calculating little gentleman, all spick and span, but with bloody hands. What a horror. Is this how it should be seen? I'm not sure, and I can tell you that for a number of years this old image has already altered quite a bit. It was Albert Mathiez, the first one, Aulard's great rival at the Sorbonne, French History Academy. After Mathiez, Monsieur Albert Soboul, then Jean Massin, who depicted a pretty accurate Robespierre. And then, very recently, well, 2 years ago, I think, Max Gallo, who also brought back a Robespierre whose physiognomy is modified compared to the traditional image. I will now try to present Robespierre as I see it. For that, we must first have a look at the movement of 1789 to properly observe the insertion of Robespierre in the epoch. An important thing to start with is this quotation from Jules Michelet, who is a great writer, but my esteem for the historian has continued to decrease. Michelet tells us this: what is important to know is how foreign the ideas of interest were to the movement of 1789. He even adds, yes, the revolution was disinterested, and that was its sublime side. I cannot, given the evidence, believe this anymore. Let us see. What happened in the 18th century is the formation of a new class. We will call it, if you like, movable wealth. There was a great economic expansion in the 18th century. A new class of financiers, industrialists, bankers had formed. These people really represented a large part of French wealth. But they saw that, as we would say today, the levers of control were only in the hands of the aristocracy, which we will call landed wealth, since they controlled close to all the land. So this new class wanted to assert themselves. They had theorists promoting and defending their ideology. One whose name was Barnave, a lawyer from the Dauphiné, a client of the Perrier family, major industrialists in the region. And Barnave, in 1790, uttered a very important phrase. A new distribution of wealth calls for, that is, demands, a new distribution of power. In other words, we, who are very important in France, want to have our share in the management of public affairs. The opportunity that will arise for this new class is the French financial situation in 1789. Imminent bankruptcy. There are two reasons for the bankruptcy, which are the following. There is a very famous one and another one which is less famous. Famous reason, there were parasites who did not pay taxes, and it was precisely the ones called the privileged, namely the aristocracy and the clergy. But secondly, we must also think of the financial policy of the kings of France, especially Louis XV and Louis XVI, a policy of permanent borrowing. When the France of Louis XVI decides to support the insurgents of America, to whom France will give cash to wage war, Necker, Swiss, who as you might know is open quotes, in the service of France, says, all the money you want. Naturally, France is taking on huge loans, and I would say, in parentheses, that Necker doesn't lose sight of his own personal interests in the affair. He pretends to be disinterested and at this time to be no longer a banker, yet he lends himself at up to 14% interest to the French state. It's interesting, a minister of finance who charges 14% interest on a loan. This will allow him to buy the magnificent castle of Copé. So in 1789, you have the following situation. Half of the French expenditure budget goes to debt arrears, an eminently unhealthy situation. One can very well imagine that these industrialists, bankers, these wealthy people, these notables, the golden section of the Third Estate, are not going to start the revolution themselves and take to the streets. No, they need a battering ram. The battering ram is quite found. It is the small people, the pleb. If you read an entertaining book, which would not want to be, but which is, a book by Monsieur Gaxot of the French Academy on the French Revolution, you will read this surprising sentence. In short, in 1789, the whole was plush. I assure you that it is marvelous to think the whole was plush. Someone who God knows is not a communist, Monsieur Edgar Faure, who made a very good book on the fall of Turgot, and who has this very important sentence. It is true that French wealth, French national wealth, had increased tremendously in the 18th century, and this had resulted, wrote Edgar Faure, in making the poor poorer. Monsieur Godechaux, still today, I believe, the dean of the Faculty of Letters of Toulouse, and who made an important collection which is called The 30 Days Which Made France, brings us figures. I will give you some of these figures. Who are the workers at this time? It's overwhelmingly the field workers, mostly day laborers. But there are also more workers in the cities than one might imagine. There are already industrial concentrations. The workers in the fields or the workers in the cities earned, on average, about 20 souls per day in the 18th century. 20 souls, current purchasing power, 4 to 5 Swiss francs approximately. These people only earn their 20 souls when they work, of course. There are Sundays and there are a lot of non-working holy days. So these people earn their 20 souls when they work about 320 or 330 days a year. What do they eat? First and foremost, they eat what used to be called the miche de pain, the loaf of bread. Although we didn't talk about kilos at the time, it was roughly 1 kilo of bread. This loaf of bread cost 40 cents in 1750. The price will not stop increasing. The quarter loaf will go from 10 cents to 12 cents to 13 cents, and it is not by chance that July 14th, that is to say, the day when the Bastille was taken, which I am going to talk about, is also the day when the loaf of bread is the highest. It costs 14 cents. Since you have to eat every day, even if you don't work every day, look at the situation of people who already spend 14 cents to eat, who earn 20 cents when they work. What is left for their family, for their housing, for their clothes, for their health? People are very unhappy. It is not surprising that in the year 1788 there was a lot of uproar, riots, small insurrections of misery. In April 1789, the Estates General are not gathered yet. They will meet on May 5th. In April, in Paris, a very violent insurrection called the New Year's Eve riot in the Saint-Antoine district, a working class district, where the army is called, and about 150 people are killed. A riot that leaves 150 dead in Paris is not trivial. This to show you that there was here a ram, quite available, that is to say, poor people who can be sent to die. The notables, gathered in Versailles first, then in Paris afterward, this part is well known, form the assembly called the Constituent Assembly. The notables in the Estates Generals, which had become the Constituent Assembly, thought everything was going fine. The king had indeed stepped back and given in. They were on the path to make a constitution. Consequently, these notables, that is to say, the financial aristocracy, the movable wealth, had the impression that they had won, when suddenly, on July 12th, 1789, the king reverses his position, fires Necker, who was in power, and being a banker and financier himself, favored the financiers. The king dismisses Necker and puts in his place a government that we will call ultra-reactionary, with the Baron of Breteuil. Dramatic situation. This time the Parisian bourgeoisie, the big Parisian business bourgeoisie, decides to launch itself. Not itself literally, of course, but to launch the people against the Bastille, which was the very symbol of autocracy.